Hey everyone, it's Unique History Channel. Today we're going to be reading a piece by R.W. Shufeldt, and it's called The Introduction of the Negro to the United States, the African Slave Trade. Early in the 60s, my father was the American Consul General in the city of Havana, Cuba, and while there I saw not only and visited the African and coolie sailors in the harbor, but for 2 years I had the opportunity of studying the treatment of slaves on the island by their masters. The barracoons were a familiar sight to my eyes, and I have seen many a slave punished by either the owner or the government overseer. At Cape Echion in Haiti, a year or so later, I had the opportunity of studying Negro life in a Negro city, a city of Spanish and French buildings, but at that time in dilapidated condition in the hands of blacks, who had gained it through an insurrection against their masters. During the American Civil War, I was in the South in the service of the federal government. For 40 years, I have studied the African Negro in America, and in every situation ever occupied by the ace, whether it is represented pure African stock or half or fractional caste, a slave or a free man. The existence of human slavery in one form or another dates back to the very dawn of American history. An account of the millions of beings who have thus enslaved, their histories, their lives, their deaths, and their fates afterward, will be a tale of the rankest injustice, the most dastardly murders, tortures unspeakable, fiendish cruelties, slaughter, deception, unbridled lust, tyranny, and indeed every crime, both petty and capital, that the mind can conceive of, or the hand of man has ever committed. Millions of our own species have been dealt with in this manner, and made up a tremendous death roll. No part of human history can in a way compare with it. England, Holland, Spain, Portugal, Brazil, and many other countries are deeply engaged, but none of these are more so than the United States, whose record in the slave trade is quite as foul, shameless, and abominable as that of any other nation on earth during the time it lasted. In the present volume, I shall have nothing to say on the subject of the slavery in the Far East, where it still exists in many places, as it does among the in Africa among Negroes. Neither I shall refer, except ever so lightly, to the slave trade of Great Britain or other European countries. My main objective in introducing it all is to the reader is that the character of Negroes were brought to America as slaves, their mental, moral, and physical natures, their numbers, and the treatment they received in the way of fitting or unfitting them for colonization, and how the slave trade was conducted, and how it was brought to an end. Out of all these questions, the most important by far is what kind of people, what kind of stock were these Negroes? This point has been avoided by the so-called 20th century leaders among the Negroes in the United States, and naturally so. This avoidance is seen in their published works as well as in their address and teachings. A very few exceptions to this rule occur. However, exceptions met within the writings of those have very little Negro blood in them. So as far as we can ascertain from history, the first African slaves landed in the North States and were brought by the Dutch in August 1916. John Rolfe, husband of Pocahontas, was in Jamestown at the time, and a part of his accounts of the affair has been preserved. In his diary we read that a Dutch man of Ware sold us 20 Negroes touched at Jamestown this year. Little more is known about that, and is not even certain from what part of Africa these Negroes came or how they were captured. The history of the North American slave trade dates from this event. The Dutchman came here because of the high seas, where he had his slaves on board when he met with the Virginia ship, the Treasurer, and those on board later told him that they wanted slaves in a place called Jamestown. After the Treasurer herself brought Negro slaves or servants to Virginia. Indeed, she was the first ship especially fitted out for the slave trade in this country. Subsequently, she has quite a history which has been told in the Magazine of American History in November 1891 by a writer of authority. In the year 1636, we see the ship Desire, the very first craft built in the United States for the purpose of this nefarious and disgusting traffic. Still, other vessels landed them among the coast at various points. Yet in 1649, not over 50 Negro slaves had been imported into Virginia. The Negro president of the Colored Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama, in his book called The Future of the American Negro, ignores the introduction of tens of thousands of slaves that were landed in this country during the subsequent slave trade period. It makes attempt to hoodwink his readers by asking them to believe that all the Negroes in the United States at the present time are descendants of those constituting the first cargoes brought to Virginia. He makes the statement thus The first slaves were brought to this country in the Dutch in 1619 and were landed at Jamestown, Virginia. The first cargo consisted of 14. The census taken in 1890 shows that these 14 slaves had increased to 7 million. That he meant this exactly and is still proved by what he reinstates on pages 22 and 23 of his same book. In the following words, I know that whenever the Negroes are increasing or decreasing, whether they are growing better or worse, whether they are valuable or valueless. A few years ago, some 14 of them were brought into this country, and now those 14 are nearly 10 millions. These statements are false. In the first place, 20 of these Africans were brought here upwards of 2.5 centuries ago, instead of a few years. Many thousands were added to them from 1619 to 1862, and 10 millions of Negroes he speaks of as of being in the United States are more than half our mulattoes. Mr. William Hannibal Thomas, in his work on the American Negro, had to say this: he lies with obvious readiness in all moods and degrees of informity, without undergoing the slightest remorse, and often without any apparent sense of provocation. He lies to please, to evade, conceal, to excuse, to command. He lies to be heard, and will not be silent. He has no truth to utter. And again, there is no cunning astuteness about the nature of the Negro which renders him inept in deception, and consequently enables him to hide from the many shams of his life. It has been contended that the colonists, in first introducing the Negroes in this country, were to some extent inspired by religious motives and the soul-saving proposition that was at the bottom of it, but in the course of time, the cloak woefully thoroughbred to be finally converted into a shroud in no way concealing the cadaver that might fittily stand for them in emblem of disgusting traffic. Slavery at the first prosperous in the colonies, and seeing this, not a few attempts were made to enslave the indigenous Indians, but it was an utter failure. At an early date, the British entered the field as slave traders, and they succeeded in this undertaking from the very start. Companies were formed, treaties were drawn and ratified, and the British slave trade became a powerful institution in 1713. In those days, say an authority at hand, the ship handlers of Liverpool made special displays in their windows of such things as handcuffs, leg shackles, iron collars, short and long chains, and furnaces and copper kettles designed for slavers' use. The newspapers were full of advertisements of slaves and slaver goods. The young bloods of the town deemed it a fine amusement to circulate handbills in which Negro girls were often for sale. An artist of wide repute, Stoddard, painted the voyage of the stable Venice from Angola to the West Indies. No doubt much of the same sort went on in the colonies, for New England soon took the lead in the slave trade, as it was a field full of adventure, cruelty, independence, chance for wealth, and unlimited opportunity to gratify the sexual passions with new and enslaved race. The colonial Yankees plunged into it with avidity. More in the History of Slavery in Massachusetts says, at the very birth of foreign commerce from New England, the African slave trade became a regular business, and Hopkins in his reminiscences stated in 1770 there were no less than 150 vessels belonging to Rhode Island alone in the African slave trade, and that the state was responsible for enslaving more of them than any other in all of New England. Newport, in fact, was started and built almost entirely on the African slave trade. The famous Captain John Paul Jones of the American Colonial Navy gained his experience and his early reputation along the same lines. He served in the forecastle of the slaver King George, but this vile traffic, fatal, murderous, and beastly trade bred not only adventurous sailors, but pirates, buccaneers, and every species of rascal and coward. The average slave ship in those was on about 500 tons burden. She had the length between 60 and 70 feet and was built with a special regard for speed. Her storage capacity consisted of a conspicuous hold in which rum, trinkets, powder, provisions, and slave truck were stowed away. There was an upper deck with a space between it known as the Twixt deck. This space was where the slaves were quartered during the voyage. It was less than 4 feet high, and in some slavers not even so much so. In here, in this horrid death pit, the unavoidable hole and rotten dungeon, they packed away these poor Negroes by the hundreds. The men were usually forward, shackled together in two. The women and children were Aft, though confined, they were not chained. All of them were pushed along until they touched each other, and in some instances they rammed in, and compelled to lie spoon fashion during the entire trip of many weeks. It was a little while the dead and the living were together, together in the dark. Sometimes death claimed 3/4 of them. Hunger, burning thirst, and unmitigated misery assailed them all the time. They wallowed in their own filth, breathing an air bestial in the extreme. The women were raped and ravaged by the entire crew. Hundreds of such craft were afloat at one time, swarming the slave coast of Africa, taking all manners of chances and conveying their human cargoes to the West Indies, to Europe, and to the American colonies and to Brazil. Some fine ships were in the trade, though whalers were pressed into the service, although fast slops, brigs, and brigantines. It was the money-making scheme of the day. Men would clear thousands of dollars on one trip. Slaves were all landed along the American coast. The Providencia put 4,500 into Brazil in 4 voyages. She was a steamer. Plenty of small craft were in it, hardly any bigger than an oyster slops. Some were notorious for their great speed, and in tight places they could down masts and use sweeps. So far, the great slave markets of America were concerned. During the entire time the slave trade was considered legal, the chief and almost only source of the supply was found, says a writer at the hand, along the Atlantic coast of Africa between Cape Verde in the north, Angola, and Cape St. Martha at the south. The sea here makes a great scoop into the land, as if the Brazilian part of the South American continent has been broken out of the hollow in the African coast. 2 rivers hold a host of the smaller streams come down to this sea within its limits and its contour. As a whole, it is of a mighty gulf, but there is nothing, neither bay nor inlet, through its whole extent that forms a good harbor for shipping. And the offshore islands, too, are few in number and small in extent. The land at the beach is almost everywhere low, and though the hills and the mountains may be seen flooded with a daisy haze, in the distance the rivers wind uncounted channels in the low delta lands covered with masses of mangrove and palm trees, haunted by the poisonous and vicious reptiles. The yellowish sand of sea and the black sand washings of upland mingle to form lonely tawny beaches and dunes, where the river currents are beaten back by ever-present, ever-treacherous surf. Goree and Gambia, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, and Bight of Benin, and Bight of Biafra, Bonny, and Calabar. Anami and Embers, and Congo and the St. Paul de Longo were all familiar names of the student of the slave coast literature. This was the field of operations on the African side, a hot, torrid sea, practically undented coastline, washed by a most dangerous surf. An atmosphere reeking with disease, dense, miry jungle, forest on the landing, with the very air of which was like breathing death itself. Dangers from ferocious beasts and reptiles, from hostile natives. In fact, everything places life of man under such conditions, circumstances, in jeopardy, while inward beyond lay the land of vast unknown. More or less near this latter lived the various races and tribes of so-called black people that furnished the slaves, the relatives and descendants of which are the close-blood relations of the stock of the now commonly designated as American Negroes. They were and still a savage, superstitious, and cannibalistic people. In the religion of fetishism, they see their worldly people with evil and malevolent spirits at war with nature and themselves. Lightning, thunder, rain, reptiles, witches, beasts, and birds of the prey, the cowards and the cunning among their own and other races were one and all under the control of malignant and gnostic spirits. Hundreds of the Negroes in the southern states of North America still believe in such things, and it is perfectly natural that they should, for not so many years that they left their flesh-eating relatives in Africa. These people are not only superstitious and degraded to the last degree, but ignorant and non-progressive, without the conception of the barest elemental of civilization. Recorded history, they have none. It This was the country, and these were the people whom the slave traders flocked and furnished them with their human freight to carry their infamous traffic. Rum had much to do with it. Both the slavers and the natives loved it. The whites drank it, employed it as their medium of exchange, and the stuff that got the slaves for them, and out of their great fortunes were made. Slaves were few and hard to get at first, the slavers having to purchase them from tribes as had them for sale on the coast. Every one considered the trade perfectly legitimate and honorable. On one coast, the tribe of blacks, being more powerful than a neighboring one, it would, upon defeating the battle and weaker one, capture a number of slaves, and these latter were disposed to the slavers when they came for them. Not a few tribes thus were pitted against each other as time passed, and the victorious parties found they had a growing market for slaves, and they began to make raids for no other purpose. Slaves were owned principally by the chief men of the tribe, where they were to be found when it was otherwise they had become enslaved for various offenses to individuals. Not a few Negroes were made slaves for debt, for seducing wives of their neighbors, for handling a neighbor's fetish, and other causes. Until they became numerous, these slaves were well treated by their owners, almost as members of the family. It was only after the white man came upon the coast they began to increase in number, to be kidnapped and treated cruelly, and slain by the score when the danger of discovery was imminent, and when they mutinied against their captors or owners. The Negroes of this period often killed and ate their captured enemies and slaves, and sometimes they were butchered, burned, and disemboweled, and otherwise used as sacrifices on gala days, jubilees, fetes, and on the dedication of a juju house, or on similar festivals. If anyone cares to read the horrors of the customs and ceremonies of these demons in their native lands, the customs of which are still in vogue, I can suggest no but better book than The Ethiopian by James Cameron Grant. This is a work that ought to interest anyone and everyone that may be studying the Negro problem in this country. Who dares to know what kind of stock these Negroes are derived? The length and breadth and thickness of a terrible black strain which we have soiled our racial record, a stain that unfortunately possesses properties for spreading. In 1645, slaves were becoming more difficult to obtain. The demand for them in the colonies was great and ever growing. Fortunes lay in the trade. Something must be done. So in the year when the Boston ship Rainbow was on the coast of Africa, she fell in with some London slavers who were there, who became somewhat tired and wanting for a cargo. To enliven things, the Londoners and the Yankees combined on some pretense of a row with blacks on shore, and landed a hawser, in those days called a murderer, and on one Sunday morning raided a village, killing scores of the inhabitants, enslaving some of them. Captain Smith of the Boston boat got 2 of these. He was an American and proud of the feat and of his brilliant slaughter of men, women, children. Also, but the fact that he had been the first to teach the world how to obtain slaves in Africa without waiting for them so long on the coast. On his return home, this captain was tried in Boston, but of course the courts had no jurisdiction over any acts he may have committed in the coast of Africa. So the charges against him of Sabbath breaking, kidnapping, and murder were dismissed. Both slaves were sent back to Africa. These cases cleared the African coast for all Americans who cared to go and do likewise. From a peaceful and orderly traffic, disgusting and cruel though it was, the slave trade soon enlarged by the added feature of the slave captures. Shore stations were established soon after, and verbal hells of inquinity, so these shore attacks began to be far more frequent and ever increasing in scale. Not only this, but the slavers instigated the coast tribes to make attacks against themselves for the profit that was there, and thus were enkindled between the tribes of the coast and the tribes of the interior. Notwithstanding all this, hundreds of slaves captured, and the supply by no means yet met the demand. Captain Connaught describes one of the raids in the following words: "In my wanderings in Africa, I have often seen the tiger pound upon its prey with instinctive thirst set tight for its appetite for blood, and abandoned the drained corpse. But these African negresses, who were the raiding party, were neither decent nor merciful as the beasts of the wilderness. Their malignant pleasure seemed to consist in the inversion of tortures that would formerly agonize but not slay, a slow, lingering, torturing mutilation that was practiced on the living. and in every instance of the brutality of women that exceeded the men. I cannot picture their hellish joy, while the queen of the harpies crept among the butchery, gathering the brains from each severed skull as a bon boucher for the approaching feast. Those were captured alive were sold on the coast, and the stories of raids undoubtedly interested the American colonists when they were sighted upon them and returned home of slavers. History goes to show that the colonies were at this time quite familiar with all of these outrages. English slavers were quite as bad in such matters, as in evidenced by the chapter of the treachery and murder done in 1767 on the slave ships Indian Queen, Duke of York, Nancy, and Concord. When they were up on the rivers of the slave coast, scores of Negroes were induced to come abroad these four vessels for a powwow, and they were made nearly crazy with rum, and the crews armed themselves simultaneously for slaughter and capture. These scenes followed almost defy description, and I am glad that my space will not admit of me telling the story. Both Portuguese and English women engaged in the fascinating slave trade upon their own account, some of them even going to the coast of Africa. Here they lived in stations on shore or uprivers in these barbaric palaces of wealth, culture, barbarity, and blood money. The home of Don Pedro was an example of these, and his sister lived with him. He left the coast example for these, and his sister lived with him. The raids in Africa were carried a score of leagues inland, and untold and unspeakable atrocities were perpetrated upon the natives. No end of cruelty, no end of bloodshed, no end of diabolical torture was the order of the day, although the growing side by side with Americans' main efforts in a humane civilization, the introduction of all manners of merciful methods, the treatment of the African slave has nevertheless been, from start to finish, a long, drawn-out picture of hellish brutality, unbridled sensuality, and demoniacal practices. No other kind of cattle has ever been thus dealt with in this world's history. In a panorama of beastly infamy, sometimes the cargo of Negroes aboard a slaver mutinied. A case occurred in 1844 aboard the American slaver Kentucky, which left the coast with 530 slaves aboard. They were in hold and packed together as usual, chained to. The mutiny was quickly suppressed, but the captain decided to make an example of the ringleaders. He shot and hanged 46 of the men and one negress. They deponed one of the crew, and verses after this was over, they brought up and flogged about 20 men and 6 women. In 1835, the Baltimore clipper Napoleon made one cargo, a net profit for $100,000, but such facts have little to do with the present work. They simply show the insensitive they kept the filthy enterprise, making men blind to the trouble they were heaping up in this country for following generations to get out as best they could. And many of the colonists long foresaw the evils that would someday come from the interbreeding between blacks and whites in the United States. No manner of no doubt. Even as clearly as 1705, Massachusetts imposed a tax on each slave that came within her jurisdiction, and this was distinctly for the better preventing of surprise mixed issue. Those that sought such venances were so numerous that café au lait progeny, which began to appear in the population, exciting the alarm of the legislators in the state. It is wonder that some of the southern states did not likewise see this pending danger, especially in a later date when it became more evident. For it be known, South Carolina, for example, had in 1734 no fewer than 22,000 slaves against 5,000 white within her limits. Possibly together as many of hundreds of thousands of Negro slaves were during the history of the slave trade brought to the United States from Africa. There be 4 million of unmixed African Negroes in this country at the present 1914, and the remainder of the 10 million that the writers on the subject are half-castes, hybrids pretending crossing with the whites. From the times the slaves were brought here in this country, up to include the time when they were set free as a result of the Civil War, they were causing the framing and enforcing of no end of laws, of starting sorts of legislations, the formation of the parties against the trade, the exciting of the church action, of strife and many kinds of outbreaks and passions of speech. It is not the intention of the present work to pass in the history of this part of subject. It is the darkest and dirtiest page in American history, and I must leave it to those who care to follow along on their lines. Indeed, it would have been enough for this chapter I merely stated the fact that the North American slave trade practically began when the Dutch brought plenty of them in Virginia in 1619. And upwards, among 400,000 of these were benighted, ignorant semi-simians, superstitious and treacherous cannibals, up to 1862 landed upon our shores. The entire traffic was horrid in the extreme, and the industry it has done is still powerfully doing those of Anglo-Saxon descent. The United States of America is immeasurable. Okay, thank you.